evening. My name is Guy Lesser, and this is sort of like most people's worst nightmares, because normally I spend endless hours struggling with putting words together and figuring out what I'm going to say. But I kind of decided on my way over here, I had an idea of the ends meet problem. And it goes to the heart of how I have this theory that I've completely misspent my entire adult life by having decided to become a writer. You know, I thought I'd be, I don't know, a ballerina or a fire chief or a lawyer or something. Then somehow I took a terrible, terrible turn. And I'm not somebody who makes budgets. I sort of have this very sophisticated notion of personal finance, which boils down to looking at my bank account and seeing if it's less than zero. And if it is less than zero, then I don't write any more checks. So I tend to, take an approach which is, how can I cut expenses? And for a period of time, I lived a life of perfectly gilded homelessness, thinking that if I could eliminate rent from sort of the monthly budget, that would help a great deal. So my first experience of gilded hopelessness took place with the theory of being in exactly the right place at precisely the wrong time. And it was out in the Hamptons in a sort of splendid beach house, which was very, very splendid, except that there was no one else at the beach. And of course, it snowed. So, there was the moment in winter when there was 4 feet of snow on the ground and I ate cornflakes for 3 or 4 days. This was followed by another cliche of the writer's life, which was moving to the Adirondacks to an absolutely classic sort of Stanford white cottage on a lake. And it was a friend who had it and said, oh, you've got to write your book, and I've got to write my book. It would be wonderful to have you here. And I thought that was very wonderful. So I thought, I'll go to this wonderful, idyllic paradise in the Adirondacks. Only she'd gotten a speaking tour about 3 hours before I arrived, so she gave me the keys to her new Jeep Cherokee and told me when the 2 Abyssinian insane cats got fed, and then introduced me to the little chocolate lab puppy, which had already acquired all those terrible big dog habits and adolescent boy habits of death wishes. So, and none of the yellow jackets. So there I was on the porch entirely alone, and all of that was fine, except for the fact that she'd had a book dedicated to her, which was a kind of serial killer, unified field theory. And it had come out about a week before, and it had been dedicated to her, and she left me a copy. So I was in this 15, 16 bedroom house entirely alone, and I was reading this book and realizing that all these people who were part of the serial killer conspiracy that the author was explaining were in prisons all around the house. And that was fine, but the house creaked, and there were noises unfamiliar to me who'd grown up in cities. So it was a bit worrisome when I saw people shining flashlights. And I was imagining running out onto the lawn of the house yelling, I'm not Marion! Don't kill me! There was always something, there was like a light from there was always a rational explanation. Anyway, so I began to realize that all these houses that I borrowed were in some sense haunted. And this was sort of the first haunted house, but it was not the last haunted house. The real haunted houses came when I moved to Italy. And Italy was even more disastrous to be an unemployed, penniless writer trying to make ends meet by not paying rent. And the first one was very nice, because it was also a beach house, and I was now used to living in uninhabited beach houses in the dead of winter. And this one was haunted by the worst thing imaginable, which were hundreds and hundreds of dead, stuffed, endangered species. Because the friend who inherited the house had a father who inherited a great liquor fortune, and all he loved doing in life was shooting endangered species. So he'd shoot them and have them stuffed, and then bring them back to this beach house in Italy. So it was kind of a weird version of Southern California with this sort of population of dead animals who stare at you all night. Bengali tigers, rhinoceroses. It was a very strange place. But then I settled permanently in perhaps the strangest house I've ever lived in, which had been famous because it was literary, and English people really liked it, because it had been the house of Lord Byron's last mistress, Teresa Gamble Guiccioli. And there was a Henry James stories about lost letters, and it was kind of modeled on her. And this was nice, except it had been divided by 3 sisters. And the 3 sisters were the rich sister, the intellectual sister, and the really poor and bitter sister. And they all despised each other. And of course, nobody had lived in the intellectual sister's part of it. I'm only about 3 minutes away from it. Until I arrived. And that was, it kind of threw the balance out between the three sisters, because I got the ballroom, which, well, I got half the ballroom because the ceiling had been lowered and there was now an apartment above. But the ballroom was very nice because it joined the tomb of Teresa Gambo Weechley. And of course, the three sisters could agree about nothing except they wanted to sell the house, but no one wanted to buy it because it was about 10 miles outside of Florence. And so it had been for sale for 25 years, and a few things had gone, like the garden. There was, the rose bush with the 25-foot long stem with a single rose at the end of it. And there was this wonderful green pond. And I realized I was living in a Friday the 13th movie that was set in Italy. It was not necessarily so good, but, it was free, I thought. And that was good. And so, I'd get up and I'd write my, 500 words each day on my typewriter. And then something very odd began to happen. Whenever I would sort of get up for a moment, I would go into a back room, and suddenly these wonderful 18-foot high doors, which faced the green garden with, the pond and the incredible rose, would begin to close. And I went out and there'd be nobody there. And that went on for weeks. And then finally, I realized that it was the caretaker's wife. And the caretaker's wife and the caretaker both despised me. They thought I was the spy of the owners, and they really didn't like me. And so, I was learning Italian. And so finally I found her, and there she was closing the door, and she was mumbling to herself, "Tutti imbarchi, tutti imbarcaggio, et embarking." They were all going away, and they were embarking. And so it was very good, because it was my first occasion to make a joke in Italian. And I said to her, with all of the heart that I could, "Signora, io non sono un pipistrello, madam, I am not a bat." And all I can tell you is that, if you're trying to make ends meet, and you're not very good at making budgets, and you have no idea whether you're zero or not in the bank, the only thing that saves you is trying to have a sense of humor about yourself.